Well, good morning. It's great to be with you today, and we are launching a brand new series, actually a 5-part series called Beyond Happy, and I thought it would be really good to tell you why we are doing this series. The reason that we're doing this series is because the reason that we're doing Beyond Happy is that there's actually something beyond happy. There's something beyond happy. And so we're glad that all of you are with us today. I want to welcome all of those who are online and joining us, whether you're watching from a hotel room or your living room. Thanks so much for being with us here today. And if you miss a part of this series, you miss a Sunday church in the next couple weeks, there's a couple easy ways for you to track along with us. The first and probably the best way is to download our mobile app, and you can go and you can click on one of the messages and listen during just a really convenient time for you. And if you don't have a smartphone, you can go to our website, go to pathwayschurch.us, and you can find today's message as well as other messages a part of this series. And probably the best way is for you to pick up one of these study guides. I know we gave these out last weekend and this weekend as well. And so if you're a guest this weekend, please, this is totally on us. We want you to have this study guide. There's some great resources, background information about the book of Philippians as well as the author, great content, places where you can take notes, and then something called Beyond the Row. Beyond the Row, you're in an environment right now, it's called the Row. We come on the weekend, we sit in the row, but there's something beyond the row called the circle. And so there's some questions that we have designed for you to get into a small group. We call small group circles here and with other Christians. And this weekend is a great weekend because we want every single person to be in a small group. We're launching small groups this weekend. You can go online, sign up for a small group. You can do that in your dorm room or apartment complex or in your living room. You can find some people at a coffee shop. Heck, you can, or listen to this, you can ask somebody out from Pathways Church on a little Christian date. Wouldn't that be awesome? This actually took place in our fall series on Jesus Way, and there's a couple that's now together because of these matchmaking kinds of messages. I'm just saying, God uses me. What can I say? So pray for them that they are not only happy, but beyond happy together. So church is a good thing. Hey, if you're here today and the God thing isn't your thing, like I get it. Maybe you lost faith or you drifted or some preacher was like boring and didn't give a lot of useful information. You grew up in church and was religious, and so you've kind of drifted. You're unchurched, de-churched. We're so glad that you're with us. This is a great series to track because all of us want to be happy. You want to be happy, I want to be happy. And what if there was something beyond happy? Oh, that's kind of interesting. Oh, by the way, are there any guests? If you're a guest here today, first time at Pathways Church, can I just see your hand? Some of you are like, I'm not raising my hand right now. If you're raising your hand, thank you so much. Nothing weird is going to happen. Yeah, great. Thank you for being here. If you didn't raise your hand, but you're a first-time guest, or you did raise your hand, I'm only going to ask you to do one thing this weekend. So if you're a guest and you didn't raise your hand, or you raised your hand, just go like this right now. Just go like this. One thing. I'm going to ask you to do one thing, and here's the one thing. I'm not going to ask you to believe what I'm talking about this weekend. I'm not even going to ask you to agree with me. And I'm not even going to say, would you like the way I present it? Although if you did, I would be happy about that. But here's what I'm going to ask. That's my best joke. Johnny actually gave that to me backstage. Okay. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask that you would come back next weekend. Because today is kind of like an introductory message to this series. And so next weekend we'll build on this weekend. And so I want you to be here next weekend. Thanks so much for being a part of Pathways. All right, so to get started today, I want to tell you what kind of quest that we are on. See, we're not really on a truth quest, and we're not really on a do-it-the-right thing kind of quest. We're on a happiness quest. I want to be happy. So if you give me 3 options, I'm going to look at those options, whether it's a degree program or a vacation spot or perhaps a new car. I'm going to select my heart, my inclination. It's a heart thing. My heart is going to go for the one option that makes me the happiest. And then I'm going to tell my brain, hey, brain, why don't you go find some reasons to support my happiness quest because I want to be happy. And you want to be happy. But the problem is, and I know a lot of you know the problem, but here's the problem. The problem is that what makes me happy today makes me unhappy tomorrow. What makes me happy today makes me unhappy tomorrow. I mean, just think about it. Let me just be very blunt for you. People get married for the same reason as they get divorced for. Well, he makes me happy. Now he doesn't make me happy. Well, if I marry her, she's going to make, if I marry him, they're going to make me happy. I mean, if you stop and think about it, people, they start and stop smoking basically for the same reason, because it makes me feel really good. Oh, you know what? My breath and my black lung, I don't feel good. I'm going to stop smoking. I mean, we're on a happiness quest. And the crazy part is that when we start chasing these things, we have reasons to kind of reverse and go back. And we kind of say, you know what, I don't want to do that anymore. And we start doing things that we don't want to do. In fact, we buy things. People market and send messages to us all the time. We buy things that we can't afford. And we do things that we shouldn't do, all in the name of happiness. And the crazy part, and here's the crazy part, the crazy part is that we have no one to blame except ourselves. We chase happiness and we have no one to blame except ourselves, because you want to be happy and I want to be happy. But here's the question that we don't ask ourselves, and this is an important question. Here's the question. Am I being completely honest with myself? Am I being completely honest with myself? Another way to say this question when it comes to happiness is this. Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And you have to pause and say, really? Why am I doing this really? Like, what's the real reason that I'm making this decision to buy this thing or to do this thing? Like, what is the real reason? And the reason that we don't ask ourselves this question right here, the reason we don't ask ourselves this question, because this question is uncomfortable and it's convicting. It's convicting to get inside of ourselves and to learn our motives and explore our heart and to say, why am I doing this really? Like, what is this really about? And if you take this question, one of the areas of life that we apply it to oftentimes is our circumstances. There's no other time in our lives when we want to see something change than when it comes to our circumstances. I mean, if you stop and think about it, if our circumstances are uncomfortable, if our circumstances aren't good, oftentimes we just want to stop. We want to stop doing those things. We ask ourselves, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this job? Why am I doing this diet? Why am I doing this relationship? Why am I doing whatever you're doing? Why am I doing it? And if the answer to that question is not happiness, here's what we do. We whine and complain. We ask God to change our circumstance, or we do whatever we do to get out of the circumstance that we're in. But here's what I want you to know this weekend. I want you to know that your circumstance is the exact place, your circumstance is the exact place where your character is being formed and your calling is being fulfilled. Right where God has you, God knows where He has you. Whether it's by your choice or by your rebellious heart or wherever you're at, your circumstance, whether it's a debt mountain or a bad marriage or some troubling work situation, God knows exactly where you are, and He has you there in order to form your character and to fulfill the calling that God has in your life. And this is so apparent when we look at God's Word, the Bible. Around here at Pathways, we teach directly from God's Word, the Bible. And there's a phenomenal story that we're going to explore the next 5 weeks out of the book of Philippians. Now, if you're new to Bible study, the Bible is divided into two sections. There are 39 Old Testament books and 27 New Testament books, comprising of 66 books of the Bible. And we believe that God inspired every author over a 2,000-year period to talk about one central theme: His love, His hope, His redemption for you and me. And not only did these writers just write about it, these writers were transformed by God's hope and message and grace and his view of redemption. In fact, one of those writers, it's a guy by the name of Paul. And if you know your Bible, Paul's one of the great apostles, one of the great workers, missionaries of the Christian faith. And when Paul starts out, we first meet him in the book of Acts. So in the New Testament, it begins with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, known as the Gospels. And then the next book is the book of Acts. It's the Acts of the Apostles. And so we meet for the first time Paul, who at that time his name was Saul. We meet him in chapter 7. And actually, he's there. He's in the episode, the scene where the first Christian martyr died for his faith. That person's name was Stephen. Stephen actually had a vision of Jesus standing and waiting on him as people were stoning him. And those who were stoning him, here's what they did. They actually took their coats and they dropped them at the feet of Saul. Saul was an accomplice. He was a Christian killer, and yet God used his circumstance, that episode, and 2 chapters later in chapter 9, Saul meets Jesus as he is on his way traveling to Damascus. And Jesus calls to Saul, and he says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? He's using his circumstance to transform Saul's life, and he transforms him such that Saul receives a new name. And after Acts chapter 9, we see the evolution, we see the heart change of Saul, moving from a Christian killer now to a guy by the name of Paul, who becomes the greatest missionary of the New Testament. Authored 13 books of the New Testament, 3 critical missionary journeys, raised up and discipled and mentored and grew hundreds of leaders. He was the apostle to the Gentiles. In fact, old Pete had all the Jews covered, but Paul was given to the church. He was given to the Gentiles. So all of his missionary journeys really impacted the gospel that you and I hear today. In fact, if it wasn't for Paul, some of us wouldn't be sitting in the seats. We wouldn't be in the rows today because God used Paul in a tremendous way. And it was in his circumstances, Acts 7, Acts 9, and all through his letters that God was shaping and transforming Paul to discover something that was beyond happy. What if there was something beyond happy? So in Philippians chapter 1, we're going to hear, if you have a Bible, you can take your Bible, turn to Philippians chapter 1, mobile device, and we're going to look at a passage in Philippians chapter 1. Beginning in verse 12, this is what Paul writes. He says, he's writing to the church at Philippi. And next weekend, we're going to talk about the context and how the church got started and some of the dynamics of the church at Philippi. It was actually a really cool church. It was a rocking church. God used this church to support Paul in some really cool ways. But this week, I want to talk about our circumstances and how really to be beyond happy when it comes to our circumstances. This is what Paul says. He says, now I want you to know. Let me pause there just for a second. When people were writing letters in that day, in the first century, writers would use this phrase as a transitional phrase. Now, I want you to know. They were transitioning from kind of the initial greeting to talk about their own personal circumstance, okay? So as a reader, you would kind of clue in and say, okay, now Paul's going to talk to us about his circumstance. Because the church in Philippi had heard what Paul was enduring, and so they sent one of their followers, one of Jesus' followers from Philippi to check on Rome. A guy by the name of Epaphroditus. Okay, if you're naming a child, I would suggest that you do not use that name, okay? Cross that off your list. I don't even know what you would call him. Epat, okay? Epaphroditus. Don't use that. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. So what happened to Paul? Paul's writing this letter from a prison cell in Rome. He's hundreds of miles away, and he's writing from Rome, Italy. Rome is the authority structure, the power of that known day. And so there he is in chains, and he's writing something that happened to him. He didn't cause this. He was an innocent, V-word, victim. And how many times in our culture, when we're victims, what do? We get bitter, angry, we blame somebody else. Oh, that's not my fault. I didn't have anything to do with it. We give up on ourselves, we give up on God. And that's not what Paul was doing. Paul actually said, this happened to me, but I want you to know something, that this has actually served to advance the gospel. You talk about a tough circumstance for a moment. Actually, going to prison. And maybe some of you are here today and you spent time in a prison cell, but can you imagine if you were in prison? somebody from our congregation had posted something unknowingly that I was going to talk about prison this weekend. They posted something on social media and it went like this. If you and I woke up in prison tomorrow using only 4 words, what would you say to me? And so I just got a kick out of that. I was like reading it and I thought, oh man, I cannot wait to see what people, how they respond. Somebody said, somebody posted it and said, man, that was fun, exclamation mark. So whatever happened last night, that was a lot of fun. And so another person posted, said, pass me a beer. Okay, so that was a bad joke, sorry, preacher humor. Here's what Paul would have said. Did the gospel advance? Just write that down. Just write down on your notes, my circumstance equals, did the gospel advance? Do you realize how singular Paul was in his focus in viewing his circumstance as he writes this introductory statement to the church of Philippi? He said, this has happened to me. I didn't cause it. I didn't create it. I didn't steal money. I didn't embezzle. I didn't do anything. And yet I'm sitting in a prison cell, and I just want you to know, instead of updating the church on how he was doing, Paul was reporting on how the gospel was doing. How many times have you ever been in a sticky situation and circumstance and somebody says, oh, how are you doing? And all of a sudden you say, well, you know, I'm not doing too well. I'm a little low on money. I could use some prayer. Paul says, he clears all of that out and he says, you know what? This has happened to me actually so that the gospel, it's served so that the gospel can advance. Can you imagine for a moment if there were a group of people that when they viewed their circumstance, all they were viewing was, how does the gospel get pushed forward because of my life? How can the gospel get pushed forward in the midst of my brokenness or some of my past? How can the gospel get pushed forward in my bad marriage? What can happen in this moment so that the gospel can go out when I go to school and I'm ridiculed and everybody looks at me and says, you know what, evolution or the Big Bang Theory or whatever it is, transgender or some dysphoria about some issue in life. And we would say as a group of people, did the gospel get advanced through our circumstance? That's what Paul says. He says, the gospel was advanced through my circumstance. Look in the next verse. He says this is how it happened. As a result, it has become clear throughout 2 places, the whole palace guard, 2 groups of people. The entire palace guard heard a clear message of the gospel, and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Do you hear me today, friends, that Paul did his best work in his worst circumstances? Can it be true that God can use you to do your best work in your worst circumstances? I think it can be. I think wherever your pressure points are right now, wherever your stress level is right now, whatever circumstance you're facing right now, God can use you to do your best work in your worst circumstances. Paul wrote his greatest letters from a prison cell. He wasn't on like some Mediterranean cruise, the Royal Caribbean, hanging out and, having like a, shrimp cocktail and, you know what, I'm going to write a letter to some people today about old Jesus. What do you think? Sounds good. Break out the ink pen, got a nice little suntan, I'm good to go. On my diet, I'm looking good on the treadmill. Man, Paul was up underneath a Mack truck with chains and shackles all around him, and he's saying, Jesus, can the gospel advance through this? Because if the gospel can advance through this, it can advance through anything. Because here's the deal. God works through adverse circumstances, and God can work through your adverse circumstances. In fact, God can use your circumstances to advance his gospel. Key word right here, say it with me. If you let him. And you say, well, what do you mean if I let him? If you stop whining and complaining. And I know if you're a guest, you didn't show up to church today for somebody to say you whine and complain, but you know what? I do it. If you stop throwing a pity party, if if you stop living in how people identify you or your past, if you stop labeling yourself, and if you can say, God, you Romans 8:28 isn't a verse that you just put on your mug. Romans 8:20, that's a verse that you live out. All these verses that we find in Philippians, there's so many verses in Philippians that just sound great on greeting cards and things. You know, like when Paul says, Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Do you get the verse and the power and the punch of the verse? He says it from a Roman prison cell. It's all your circumstances. God works through adverse circumstances. Let's continue on and see what Paul says. Kind of interesting. You drop down to verse 14. He says, and because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become, If you've been tracking with us, last series, My Confidence is Coming Back. Because of my chains, Paul says, people are getting confident in who? In the Lord. Not confident in Paul, like, oh, that was a great example, Paul. You did a great job. Wow, you are a 110% kind of Christian. No. Paul says, no, they're becoming confident in the Lord, not self-confident, but God-confident, and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. Can you imagine for a moment if you were staring at the worst circumstance possible in your own life right now? Maybe you have a family mess going on. Maybe you have aging parents that are just struggling and they're battling a physical thing and they're losing their mind, but they think they're not losing their mind, that they're okay. And you as a child, you're trying to lead up in that situation. Or maybe you have a son or a daughter who's kind of strayed off, drifted off the path, and they're just rebellious, and you know what's coming down the road, and there's so much fear and anxiety inside of you. Or maybe you're staring at chapter 7 and you're thinking to yourself, I'm going to lose everything. And yet I got to come to church today, and I got to sing a song, Bless the Lord, and 10,000 reasons, and I don't have one reason. What if? What if? What if there was something that was beyond happy? What if you could face your worst circumstance and you could be without fear? Can you imagine what your life would look like if you could face the most adverse circumstance and say, I am without fear in this moment because I know who has saved me and redeemed me. I know where I stand as a son or daughter of the Most High God, and here I stand because he's going to see me through this, and the gospel is going to advance, and glory is going to go to his name because of where I am right now. Whoa. You talk about a game changer. Statements like that will change the course of not only your history, but the course of your marriage and your family and generations to come. That's what Paul says in verse 14. People are gaining confidence. Let me say it another way. In other words, you can say it this way. Here's the statement. How you respond to your circumstance, how we respond to our circumstances, impact how others put their confidence in God. Right? How many times you've heard somebody say to you, because I've heard it a lot, hey, I'm a Christian, I follow Jesus, and then all of a sudden they get tucked up on something hard and they start acting like everybody else does. And you think to yourself, really? That's how deep your faith is? That's called a fair weather Christian. See what I'm saying? Let pressure and let bad circumstances hit somebody and you will see what Christ they really follow. Pressure comes. See what happens. Pouting, praise, what happens? Just give me another P. I can't think of one. See what I'm saying? Prayer. See what happens. All right. So that's where Paul goes. And then in verse 20, if you drop down, this is interesting. Paul goes from a Christian killer and he goes to a missionary of grit and grace. And I want you to understand this grit. Sometimes I think we miss how strong people of faith are. This is what Paul says in verse 20. He says, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed. Let me just pause there. What Paul is saying, I place some expectations on myself. I have some goals. And not only are they my goals, but I'm praying to God that God would fill me with hope so that I would live a life that is unashamed of the gospel. So powerful. but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether it's by life or by death. Now, what Paul is saying, he is going from a prison cell, and he's saying to the church at Philippi, you know what? I'm in prison today, but regardless of my circumstance, I don't care what circumstance. He kind of just yanks the camera and he zooms out and he says, whether it's in life or in death, I just don't want to be ashamed of the gospel. And then one of the huge verses of the book of Philippians, everything turns on this verse. This is what Paul says in verse 21. Here's his verse. He says, for to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. For me. Can you say that for you? Paul says, for me. In fact, he writes and he goes on and he says, I struggle. Should I stay in the body? Because it would be to your benefit. But yet, man, I yearn to go with God because, man, if I went with God, I would be in perfect peace and joy eternally. And so Paul can say from a prison cell, it doesn't matter. For me, his own testimony, for me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. Pretty powerful stuff, isn't it? Wouldn't you agree? So, what do you do with your circumstances? How do you get there? How do you get from a prison cell to now just having this expansive statement that says, for to me to live is Christ and to die is gain? Here's what you need to do. You need to do something. You need to place your circumstances under the authority of God. Now there's a lot of loaded words here. So let me just try to break this down. You got to take your circumstances, your current situation in life, wherever it is, and you got to place it under the authority of God. Here's how you do that. Two ways. First, you have to have a knowledge base. You have to have a knowledge of who God is. You have to understand who God is, because if you understand who God is, it makes it a lot easier to get up underneath him and to take your circumstances underneath him. And then when you understand who he is, then what you need to do, because there's a lot of people who understand who God is, and yet they can't take their circumstances and put your circumstances underneath him. You know why? Because they don't want to surrender. That's one of the most painful words in Old Webster. If you're in your 20s, you don't know what Webster is, but in Google. Okay? If you're a millennial, Google. Just substitute, I'm sorry. I'm like right on the threshold of being old and young, so some days... I was actually out with went over to our student ministry on Wednesday night, and I was hanging out a little bit, and somebody, I'm not going to name their names, but they walked up to me and said, "You actually look cool tonight." And I thought, great. Guess I don't look cool on Sundays, but I'm glad I look cool today. I don't know what I did different, but anyways. Surrender. And sometimes we think it's more of a head issue. If I could just get more knowledge, I could actually, and actually it's just a heart issue. Saying I give up. I'm done trying. And the amazing thing is that God will arrange the circumstances of your life such that at one moment you will give up. If you've lived long enough, you know you're going to get kicked in your teeth. It's going to be rough. And then you have options. All right. So, any questions so far? Are we good? We know where we've been? Okay, just to review, real quick, here's what we've said so far, just to review. We've said, what makes me happy today makes me unhappy tomorrow. And we talked about our circumstances, that we like to change our circumstances. We looked at the life of Paul, and we asked the question, what's going on? Why do I really do this? Why am I doing this, really? Like, we've looked at that. Now, there's one thing that every single happy person has. There's one thing. And when I say a thing, it's not like really a thing. You can't hold it in your hands. It's kind of squishy. It's intangible. But there's one thing that every happy person has. This is the one thing that they have. The one thing that every happy person has is contentment. They're content. It doesn't matter. They're content in their circumstance. Now, just think about for a moment. Think about the happiest person that you've ever met. Think about happy people. I don't know. Think about people, somebody in your family. You just meet them and they're happy. They walk around happy and you think to yourself, why are they so stinking happy? Because you make more money than them and you drive a nicer car and you go on better vacations than they do. And you're thinking to yourself, they're just like happy. Like, why is that? These kinds of people are just comfortable in their own. You know who they're happy with? They're happy with themselves. They're comfortable in their own skin. They know they might have quirks. They know that, whatever. They're not airbrushed and they don't meet fitness goals and all that. But you know what? They're just happy. They're comfortable with who they are. They're comfortable in their own skin. In fact, sometimes you look at their circumstances and you think to yourself, are you in denial? Like, I'm more worried about your circumstance than you are. You're like, hello, anybody there? Anybody home? And yet they're just content. And so let me, if all of this is true, if all is what I'm saying is true, then let me just kind of shift gears one more time. And this is the reason, here's the critical question. This is the reason that's so important that you come back next weekend, because we're going to answer the question, how do I find contentment? How do I find contentment? If this is my circumstance and this is happiness and there is something beyond happy, how do I get contentment? That's the question that we're going to answer next weekend. All right, so if you found any of this content useful or helpful, and you think to yourself, oh, I wish I would have invited somebody like my cousin or my boss or my girlfriend, then next weekend you have a great opportunity to do that, okay? Make sure also that you check out a small group. We want as many people as possible to get into a small group, have some conversations around the content. It's only useful if you continue to soak and kind of marinate in the scriptures and some of the points and things. Just gnaw on that bone a little bit more this week, okay? And see what the Holy Spirit will do and kind of continue to transform inside of you. Well, thanks so much for being here. And next week we'll begin part 2 of Beyond Happy. God bless you.